The heat of the Nevada summer pressed down like a physical weight, baking the dust of Silas Brandt's homestead into a fine, pale powder. He drove the post-hole digger into the unyielding earth, his shoulders aching with a familiar burn. It was a lonely work, but a satisfying one. Each post planted was a mark of his own making, a testament to the 4 years he had poured into this 160-acre claim. His only companion, a dark-furred German shepherd named Kaiser, lay in the sliver of shade cast by the half-finished barn, his tail giving a lazy thump every so often. Suddenly, Kaiser's ears pricked up. A low growl rumbled in his chest, and he rose to his feet, a black and tan statue of vigilance pointed toward the dusty track that served as a road. Silas straightened, wiping a forearm across his sweat-slicked brow. He followed the dog's gaze and saw it, a figure, small and wavering in the shimmering heat haze. It was too small to be a man on horseback, and it moved with the slow, deliberate pace of someone who had been walking for a very long time. As the figure drew closer, details swam into focus. It was a girl, hardly more than 18. She was Chinese, her face pale and smudged with dirt, her black hair pulled back in a severe knot that had begun to fray. She wore a simple, high-collared dress of grey fabric, worn but clean, that seemed entirely out of place in the rugged landscape. In one hand, she clutched the handle of a battered brown suitcase, in the other, she held something small, though he couldn't make out what it was. She stopped a dozen yards from him, just beyond the edge of his tilled vegetable patch. Kaiser's growl deepened, but Silas put a hand on the dog's head, and the sound subsided into a tense quiet. The girl's eyes, dark and wide, flickered from Silas to the dog and then to the small, clapboard house he had built with his own hands. She took a deep, shuddering breath, as if steeling herself. "Excuse me, sir," she said. Her voice was quiet, surprisingly steady, with an accent that rounded the edges of her words. "Are you the owner of this farm?" Silas nodded, his hand still resting on Kaiser's head. He was a man who preferred solitude. His interactions with the folks in Redemption Creek, the nearest town, were limited to necessities. A lone girl appearing out of the heat was a complication he did not want. "I am," he answered, his tone flat. She took another step forward, her gaze earnest. "If you let me stay, I'll work on your farm." The words hung in the dry air between them. Silas looked her over. She was slight, almost fragile-looking. The calluses on his own hands were thicker than her wrists. The work on a homestead was brutal, unforgiving. It broke strong men. The notion that she could contribute was absurd. He was about to give her a flat, unequivocal no, perhaps point her toward the town 8 miles east and wish her luck. It was not his problem. He had enough of his own. But then his eyes caught the details. The way her knuckles were white around the suitcase handle, a grip of pure desperation. The tremor in her shoulders that she was trying so hard to control. And the object in her other hand. It was a small, crudely carved wooden bird, its paint faded. She held it not like an object, but like an anchor. He saw the sheer terror in her eyes, layered under the exhaustion. It wasn't the look of someone simply down on her luck, it was the look of someone running for her life. That raw fear stopped the refusal on his tongue. "I don't need a hired hand," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. Her face fell, the brief flicker of hope extinguished. She bowed her head slightly. "I see. I am sorry to have bothered you." She turned to leave, her shoulders slumping. He saw the slightness of her back, the vulnerability of her exposed neck. 8 miles to town under this sun, with whatever she was running from behind her. He thought of his own mother, arriving in this country with nothing but a trunk and a Bible, her face etched with that same mixture of hope and fear. "Wait," he called out. She stopped, her back still to him. Silas sighed, a long, weary sound that seemed to carry all the frustrations of the failed wheat crop from the year before. "The barn," he said, gesturing with his head. "There's a loft. It's dry. You can sleep there. For a few days. Until you figure out where you're going." She turned back slowly, her expression one of disbelief. "You mean it?" "I do," he said gruffly. "There's a well pump behind the house for water. I eat at sundown. If you're hungry, you can join me. But I expect you to work. You said you would work. A light returned to her eyes, so bright it was almost painful to see. I will, she said, her voice thick with emotion. I am a very hard worker. My name is Leanne. Silas, he replied, turning back to his post hole. He didn't want gratitude. He didn't want conversation. He just wanted to finish his fence. He heard her footsteps move toward the barn, the sound of the heavy door groaning open, and then silence. He jabbed the digger into the ground, annoyed with himself. He had just invited a storm into the quiet harbor of his life, and he had a feeling it was far too late to turn it back. The next morning, Silas rose before the sun, as was his habit. He lit the stove to make coffee and was met with a surprise. The perpetually cluttered kitchen counter was clean. The dirty dishes from the night before were washed, dried, and stacked neatly. A small pile of kindling sat beside the wood stove. He stepped outside and saw her, already in the vegetable patch, methodically pulling weeds with a focus that was almost unnerving. Kaiser was sitting nearby, watching her with a curious tilt of his head, no longer growling. Leanne proved her words true. She was a tireless worker. She moved with a quiet efficiency that accomplished more by noon than most men he knew did in a day. She mended his torn shirts with stitches so fine they were nearly invisible. She took over the care of his half-dozen chickens, and the birds, cantankerous creatures he'd always battled, seemed to calm under her gentle hand. She never complained. She never spoke unless spoken to. At sundown, she would appear on his porch, wash her hands and face at the pump, and sit at the far end of his small kitchen table. They ate in silence, the scrape of forks against tin plates the only sound. After a week, Silas found himself speaking first. The tomatoes are coming in strong, he remarked one evening, gesturing with his fork toward the garden. Leanne looked up, surprised. The soil is good here, she said softly. You just have to turn it deep. He had watched her do just that, using his heavy spade with a leverage that defied her size, her movements precise and economical. She knew things. She knew the signs of blight on a potato leaf, how to stake a bin plant to catch the most sun, how to tell which eggs would hatch. These were not the skills of a city girl. But he did not ask. Asking meant inviting conversation, and conversation meant connection. He wasn't ready for that. The unspoken agreement between them was that this was temporary. But days bled into weeks, and the summer deepened. The fence was finished. The garden was thriving. The barn loft, he knew, was now tidy, with her few belongings arranged in a neat corner. She had brought a quiet order to his chaotic existence, and he found he was breathing easier. Even Kaiser had taken to following her as she went about her chores, his protective presence a constant shadow. Silas told himself it was just useful to have the help. But he knew it was more than that. He had not realized how profound his loneliness had been until it began to lift. The real test came when their supplies ran low. Redemption Creek was a necessary evil, a place of gossip and hard stares for anyone who didn't fit the mold. Taking Leanne with him felt like a risk. Leaving her alone felt like a different kind of risk. I need to go to town for flour and salt, he announced one morning. You can stay here. She looked up from the shirt she was mending. I can help you carry things, she offered. I am strong. He hesitated. But the thought of Jedediah Finch's sneering face or the suspicious eyes of the general store owner, Mr. Gable, made him uneasy. Finally, he nodded. All right. But stay close to me. And let me do the talking. She simply nodded, her expression unreadable. Redemption Creek was just as he expected. The moment they pulled the wagon up to the general store, the usual low hum of activity on the main street seemed to pause. Eyes followed them. Men on the boardwalk stopped their conversations to watch Silas help Leanne down from the wagon seat. He felt a familiar anger tighten his gut, but he ignored it, keeping his face a stony mask. Inside Gable's mercantile, the air was thick with the smells of coffee beans, cured leather, and judgment. Mr. Gable, a man whose belly strained the buttons of his vest, watched them over the top of his spectacles. "Silas," he said, his voice oozing a false heartiness. "Need to restock. Flour, salt, coffee, and a new axe handle," Silas said, keeping his voice level. As Gable measured out the flour, Jedediah Finch pushed through the door. Finch was a man who owned a small, unproductive claim north of Silas's and compensated for it with a loud mouth and a cruel streak. His eyes landed on Leanne, who was standing quietly by the counter, her gaze fixed on a bolt of blue calico cloth. Finch let out a low whistle. Well, Brant. Didn't know you'd gone and bought yourself some fancy new help. Where'd you order that one from? San Francisco?" The air in the store went still. Silas felt a hot rush of blood to his face. He set his jaw and turned to face Finch. "She's not my help, Jedediah. And her name is none of your business." Finch laughed, a nasty, grating sound. "Getting awful particular about your property, aren't you? Careful she don't run off. They say they're not loyal." Before Silas could utter the sharp reply forming on his lips, Leanne spoke. Her voice was not loud, but it cut through the silence like a razor. "A man who judges loyalty in others," she said, her eyes lifting from the cloth to meet Finch's, "is usually a man who has none of his own to offer." She looked him up and down, a quick, dismissive glance. "Your boots are caked with mud from the North Road. But the dust on your hat is from the South, near the old silver mine. A man who walks two roads at once is not to be trusted on either." Finch's jaw dropped. He stared at her, his face turning a blotchy red. He had been known to be prospecting on another man's claim near the old mine. Her observation, simple and direct, had struck a nerve of truth so deep it left him speechless. The other men in the store shuffled their feet, a few hiding smiles behind their hands. Humiliated and exposed, Finch grumbled something under his breath, turned on his heel, and stalked out of the store. Mr. Gable cleared his throat, his demeanor suddenly much more respectful. "That'll be $4.20, Silas." Silas paid, his mind reeling. He had been ready for a fight, for fists and fury. He had not been prepared for a quiet, devastating execution by words. As they loaded the supplies into the wagon, he looked at Leanne, who was adjusting a sack of flour as if nothing had happened. She had not been fragile. She had not needed his protection. In fact, she had protected him, his reputation, with a blade of perception he never knew she possessed. The ride back to the homestead was silent, but it was a different kind of silence. The space between them was no longer filled with caution, but with a new, humming current of respect. He was beginning to realize that the girl he'd taken in was not who he thought she was at all. As they neared his land, a gust of wind plastered a piece of paper against a fence post. He stopped the wagon to pull it free. It was a wanted poster, issued by the U.S. Marshal's office. The drawing was of a Chinese man, wanted for questioning in a matter of theft in Sacramento. He read the name, Sung. The description mentioned he worked as an agent for a wealthy merchant. A cold knot formed in Silas's stomach as he looked at Leanne, who was staring straight ahead, her hands folded calmly in her lap. He crumpled the paper in his fist, suddenly certain that the trouble she was running from was far more dangerous than a cruel stepmother. That night, a summer thunderstorm broke over the valley. Rain lashed against the small house, and thunder cracked so loud it seemed to shake the very foundations. Silas had told Leanne to come inside from the barn, not wanting her to be alone in the loft during the storm. She sat in the rocking chair his mother had favored, while he stood by the window, watching the lightning illuminate the drenched fields. The confrontation in town and the wanted poster had broken the unspoken truce of silence. The questions had to be asked. He turned from the window. "Leanne," he began, his voice quiet. "Who are you running from?" She stopped rocking. Her hands tightened in her lap, her knuckles white. For a long moment, she said nothing, just stared at the floorboards. He thought she might refuse to answer, might retreat back into her shell of silence. "My father worked on the railroad," she finally said, her voice barely a whisper. "He was a good man. He loved this country, the size of it. He saved his money. He wanted to buy a small piece of land for us, like this. Her gaze swept the small room. He died when a trestle bridge collapsed. My stepmother, she did not love him. She loved his money. She paused, taking a shaky breath. Before he died, he carved this for me. She opened her hand, revealing the small wooden bird he had seen the day she arrived. It was a sparrow, its head cocked as if listening. He said sparrows are small, but they are not weak. They find a way to survive anywhere. Silas moved from the window and sat down at the table, opposite her. He waited. My stepmother used the last of his money, Leanne continued, her voice gaining a hard edge. When it was gone, she made a deal. There is a merchant in Sacramento. A man named Chen. He is old and cruel. He buys things. Silks, spices, and sometimes, girls. My stepmother sold me to him. The contract was signed. The money was paid. The words hit Silas like a physical blow. The scene in town with Finch suddenly seemed like child's play. This was not about social disgrace, this was about ownership. I was to be delivered to his house 3 weeks ago, she said, her eyes finally lifting to meet his. They were filled with a cold, clear fire. I took what I could fit in my father's suitcase, his letters, an extra dress, and I left in the middle of the night. I have been walking ever since. Now he understood the terror he had seen in her eyes that first day. It was the fear of being property, of being hunted down and dragged back to a cage. The wanted poster for the man named Sung flashed in his mind. An agent for a wealthy merchant. This merchant, Chen, Silas said, his voice low. He will have people looking for you. Yes, she said simply. He does not like to lose what he has paid for. The storm outside raged on, but the storm inside the small house was far more terrifying. Silas looked at this young woman, who had faced down public humiliation, who worked from sunup to sundown without complaint, who carried the memory of her father in the form of a small wooden bird. He had offered her a few days of shelter. But what she needed was a fortress. And he owned little more than a wooden house, a stubborn dog, and 160 acres of unforgiving dirt. He did not yet know that his choice had already been made, that the moment he'd told her to wait, he had tied his fate to hers. A week later, the threat arrived. It came not as a storm, but as a calm, well-dressed man on a fine-looking bay mare. He rode up to the house as if he were paying a social call. He was Chinese, dressed in a dark, tailored suit that looked strange and expensive against the dusty backdrop of the farm. He dismounted with practiced ease and tied his horse to the fence Silas had just finished building. Kaiser stood beside Silas on the porch, a low, menacing growl vibrating through his chest. Leanne, who had been feeding the chickens, froze. The color drained from her face. The man smiled, a thin, polished expression that did not reach his eyes. "Good afternoon," he said in perfect, unaccented English. "My name is Sung. I am looking for a young woman. She is a runaway. I have reason to believe you are giving her shelter." Silas moved to stand slightly in front of Leanne. "There's no one here by that description." Mr. Sung's smile tightened. "Let us not be difficult, Mr. Brandt. I know she is here. Her name is Leanne. She is the contracted property of my employer, Mr. Chen of Sacramento. I have the legal paperwork right here." He patted his breast pocket. "She is, in essence, stolen goods. I am here to reclaim her." "She's not property," Silas said, his voice a low growl that mirrored his dog's. "She's a person. And she's on my land." "Ah, yes. Your land." Mr. Sung's gaze swept across the homestead, taking in the small house, the sturdy barn, the flourishing garden. There was a flicker of something, perhaps contempt, perhaps calculation, in his eyes. "A fine piece of work, under the Homestead Act of 1862, I presume? You've put a great deal of effort into it. It would be a shame for all that work to be jeopardized by a legal entanglement." The threat was veiled, but clear. "I have a warrant from the territorial magistrate in Carson City," Sung continued, his voice smooth as silk. It recognizes the validity of Mr. Chen's contract. You are currently harboring a fugitive and obstructing a lawful claim. I am giving you the courtesy of resolving this peacefully. Give her to me now, and I will forget you were ever involved. Refuse, and I will return tomorrow with the U.S. Marshal. You will lose her, and you will likely face charges that will endanger your claim to this land. You have 24 hours to make your choice. He gave a slight bow, untied his horse, and mounted. I will be back tomorrow at noon, he said, before turning the horse and riding away, leaving a cloud of dust and dread hanging in the air. Silas stood frozen, the man's words echoing in his ears. Lose his claim. Everything he had worked for, bled for, was on the line. He could feel Leanne's trembling behind him. He could give her up. He could save himself. It would be the smart thing to do, the safe thing. He could go back to his quiet, lonely life. He turned and looked at her. Her face was a mask of terror, but her chin was high. She was not pleading. She was not crying. She was waiting for his decision, her small wooden sparrow clutched in her hand. He saw not the source of his trouble, but the reason his life had felt meaningful for the past month. He looked at the house she had helped make a home, the garden she had coaxed into life. Go inside, he said, his voice thick. She didn't move. Silas? Go inside, Leanne, he repeated, more gently this time. Bolt the door. She hesitated, then did as he asked. He stood on the porch for a long time, watching the dust settle on the road, Kaiser sitting faithfully at his feet. The choice was not a choice at all. It was a simple, terrifying fact. He was not giving her up. Now he just had to figure out how to survive the consequences. The next morning, Silas did not prepare for a gunfight. He put on a clean shirt, brushed the dust from his best trousers, and retrieved a metal lockbox from under his bed. Inside was his copy of the land grant, the official deed signed and stamped under the Homestead Act. He read it over 3 times, his finger tracing the legal language. At 11:30, he saw the dust on the horizon. This time, there were 2 riders, Mr. Sung and a grim-faced man with a U.S. Marshal's badge pinned to his vest. Leanne came to stand in the doorway behind him. She was holding a heavy, cast-iron skillet, her knuckles white around the handle. She was not hiding. Silas stepped off the porch and walked to the edge of his property, marked by the new fence. He held his land deed in one hand. Kaiser walked beside him, hackles raised. Sung and the marshal reined in their horses. Mr. Brandt, the marshal said, his voice hard as granite. I have a warrant to search your property and reclaim a fugitive. Step aside. With all due respect, Marshal, Silas said, his voice surprisingly calm and steady. You may have a warrant, but you are standing on the edge of my sovereign land, granted to me by the United States government. He held up the deed. This document, under the Act of 1862, gives me sole title. The matter you are here to enforce is a civil contract from the state of California. It has not been filed, heard, or recognized by a territorial court here in Nevada. He was bluffing, mostly. He had no idea about the fine points of interstate contract law. But he spoke with the absolute conviction of a man defending his home. The marshal frowned. This is a federal matter, Brandt. Don't be a fool. Is it? Silas countered, taking a step forward. Or is it a rich man in California using federal power to enforce a private debt? I am a homesteader. A citizen. I am not harboring a criminal. I am giving shelter to a woman who would have been sold into bondage. You stand there and tell me the United States government is in the business of enforcing that kind of contract on a homesteader's land. Sung scoffed. He's talking nonsense, Marshal. Arrest him. But the marshal was hesitating. He was a man of the territories, a man who understood the fierce independence of homesteaders and the deep-seated resentment of outside powers, whether they be from Sacramento or Washington. He looked from Silas's defiant face to the deed in his hand, to the snarling dog at his side, and then to the small woman on the porch holding a skillet like a weapon. This was not going to be a simple arrest. It was going to be messy, and the story of a marshal seizing a homesteader's land to enforce a rich man's marriage contract would not play well in the territory. "This ain't worth it," the marshal said finally, turning his gaze on Sung. "This is a civil matter. You take it to the circuit judge when he comes through in the fall. I'm not dragging this man off his claim for this." Sung's face contorted with fury. "This is an outrage. I will report you." "You do that," the marshal said, already turning his horse. "In the meantime, you're on your own." He gave Silas a long, hard look, a look that was part warning, part grudging respect, and rode away. Sung stared at Silas, his polished facade completely gone, replaced by raw hatred. For a moment, it looked as if he might try to force the issue himself. But then he looked at Kaiser's bared teeth, at Silas's unyielding stance, and at Leanne, who had taken a step forward off the porch. He was one man against three determined souls on their own ground. He spat on the dust, yanked his horse's reins, and galloped away, his threats dissolving into the vast, indifferent landscape. 6 months later, the first snow of winter lay like a clean white blanket over the homestead. The garden was harvested and its bounty stored in the root cellar. A new, sturdy chicken coop stood near the barn, and the woodpile was stacked high against the side of the house. The farm was no longer just surviving, it was secure. Inside, a fire crackled in the hearth. The barn loft was empty now, used only for hay. Leanne had her own room inside the house, small and simple, with a window that looked out over the field she had helped to tame. She sat in the rocking chair, and Silas sat at the table, a bundle of thin, brittle papers spread before him. They were her father's letters. Her English was good for speaking, but she could not read the written word. So, every few nights, Silas would read one to her. He finished the last line of a letter describing her father's or at seeing the Sierra Nevada mountains for the first time. He folded it carefully and placed it back on the pile. The silence that fell between them was no longer empty or cautious, but full and warm, like the heat from the fire. He looked at her, at the way the firelight softened the lines of her face. The fear was gone from her eyes, replaced by a deep, settled peace. He thought of the lonely man he had been, rattling around in this house, his only goal to endure. He had not known that a home was not just built with wood and nails, but with shared work, quiet courage, and the simple presence of another soul. He reached across the small space between them and laid his hand over hers, where it rested on the arm of the chair. She was holding the small wooden sparrow. Her fingers relaxed under his touch, and she turned her hand over, her small, slender fingers lacing with his own calloused ones. The farm was no longer just his claim. It was their home. And the future, which had once stretched before him as a long, solitary road, now felt like a shared path, leading somewhere bright. And that brings us to the end of this one. If you stayed with me all the way through, thank you. Stories like this one only get told because folks like you sit down and listen. If you liked what you heard, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you want more stories from the old frontier, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Until then, take care of yourself, and thanks again for being here.